Shoshana Bryen. I'm the Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center here in Washington. I want to welcome you to our program today, Free Speech and Intellectual Diversity on College Campuses. This is our first Capitol Hill program. We are very pleased to be here. We're very pleased by the speakers that we've brought to you today, Mona Charen, Lauri Regan, and Michael Poliakoff. And we're pleased to see what looks like an excellent audience. I hope you've brought lots of questions. My first responsibility on behalf of the JPC is to thank the Alavi Family Foundation for their generous support of the work of the JPC, and our Hill sponsor, Congressman Doug Lamborn. Congressman Lamborn had a series of hearings this morning, and he may or may not be able to drop by, but if he does, we will stop and give him a moment to greet you. I'm not going to take a long time with introductions. Our speaker bios are on your seats. There are brochures from the JPC on your seats, and copies of our magazine, In Focus. I will say that from our founding in 1985, the JPC has stood for free speech and intellectual diversity. We never thought that was a controversial position until much more recently, where we discovered that in fact it is. Free speech was very much on the minds of our founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson, the eloquent Thomas Jefferson, famously said, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," or something like that. But it appears now that we live in an age where people either fear that words will hurt them, or they believe in censorship as a blunt instrument with which to bludgeon the opposition. Mona Charen and Lauri Regan are going to talk about who is doing what to whom. And Michael Poliakoff will, I hope, give us some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of what's being done to combat the disinterest or the abhorrence, actually, of free speech. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to our first speaker, Mona Charen.
Thank you, Shoshana. Great to be here. Thank you all for coming. Sorry I was a little delayed. I didn't expect the security line. This is a quote. "This is the saddest day of my life," unquote. Those were the words of Middlebury professor Alison Stanger after she and the speaker she had invited were shouted down, mobbed, and assaulted for attempting to carry on a dialogue. The speaker was Charles Murray, the AEI. Murray, who's the author of Playing a Part and other influential works, had been invited to Middlebury by the American Enterprise Institute Club at the college. Now, I recently watched a video of the whole event, and I have to say it was a very instructive experience because it gives you a flavor of what was happening there that you don't quite get from press accounts. Several students spoke first, and they said the sorts of things that would be reassuring. They said, we believe, they described what the club was like and why they found it stimulating and challenged their assumptions, and they said they reaffirmed their belief in free exchange of ideas and so forth. Very good. The audience was snickering a little bit. There were a few catcalls, but they let these students speak. The president of the college then came up, Lauri Patton, and she stressed that while she loathed Charles Murray's ideas, that her community, that Middlebury stood for free exchange and free speech. She reminded the audience that their next speaker was going to be Edward Snowden. Anyway, she then went on to warn the students that any disruption of a speaker, because the word had already gotten out, violated the school's rules and would be punished. Finally, the student introducing Murray began with a string of statements about President Trump. Quote, "In my view, Donald Trump is unfit to be president in ways that apply to no other candidate of the two major political parties throughout American history. Many politicians lie that Trump takes first place for sheer bulk," unquote. The student then advised his audience, it may surprise you to learn that the author of those comments was Charles Murray. Well, the kids were having none of it. As soon as Murray was introduced, the students began, they all stood up, they turned their backs on Murray, and in unison, sort of Occupy Wall Street fashion, they chanted a statement that was apparently a quote from James Baldwin, and then began the slogans. Charles Murray, go away. Middlebury says no way. And racist, sexist, anti-gay, Charles Murray, go away. And so on. Well, this went on for 20 minutes. The university had a backup plan. They whisked Murray and his faculty interlocutor, Professor Stanger, to a secure location. They were able to more or less engage in this conversation in this secure location, and it was typed via video to the students who had come to hear him speak. But they were interrupted by banging on the walls and by somebody setting off the fire alarm. Now, appalling as this breach of decency, openness, and civility was, the worst was yet to come. When Stanger, another faculty member, and Murray were exiting the building, they were confronted by a mob in the parking lot, some wearing ski masks. They proceeded to assault the three people, including Murray, and Stanger said that she feared for her life. She was actually, her neck was twisted, someone grabbed her hair, someone else pushed her. She needed to wear a neck brace for several days. Once they made it to the car, the car was rocked and they pounded on the hood and so forth. Now, Alison Stanger is a liberal, and she was disgusted. After describing it as I said, the saddest day of her life, she wrote in a Facebook post, to people who wish to spin this story as one about what's wrong with elite colleges, that would be a mistake. It's what's wrong with America. And Murray, writing about it later for Newsweek, said that he has been a controversial public figure for decades, but this is the first time that he had seen the heckler's veto triumph so thoroughly. Now, the Middlebury episode follows other suppressions of speech and self-righteous tantrums at other universities. At Brown in 2013, New York's Police Commissioner Ray Kelly was shouted down. 2 years later, Brown hosted a debate between two feminists about rape culture, and students who were triggered by this topic were provided with a room that was stocked with cookies, coloring books, bubbles, Play-Doh, calming music, pillows, and so forth. At the University of California, Irvine, the Israeli ambassador in the United States was prevented from speaking. At Claremont McKenna College in April, Manhattan Institute scholar Heather McDonald was greeted by a mob, and so forth. There were other instances like this, greeting Ann Coulter, Milo Yiannopoulos, and others. There's a new rite of spring in America, and that is disinviting conservative speakers from college campuses. This has happened to George Will, Christine Lagarde, Condoleezza Rice, I mean, you wouldn't even call Christine Lagarde a conservative, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and many others. At Yale, there was a great battle over Halloween costumes. Now, why adults, and these students are all over 18, why adults are still wearing Halloween costumes has not yet been explained to me. I think maybe Ben Sass needs to weigh in on this. But in any event, you've probably all seen a video of this entitled bratty student screaming at the top of her lungs at a professor. A professor who, I might add, is an MD, PhD, a specialist in how our social networks affect overall health, and a person who believes in free speech and in dialogue. But he got shouted out. And by the way, what's the follow-on? Were any of those students punished by the university? No. In fact, two of them involved in that confrontation with Christakis. Christakis and his wife, by the way, have both resigned. Two of the students received awards at graduation. So, unfortunately, the examples of intolerance, bullying, groupthink, and accompanying cowardice on the part of faculty and administration are very real. One self-described liberal professor said that he was frightened of his students, his liberal students. A Bernie Sanders supporting professor at Evergreen State was threatened for objecting to a day of absence. So, college administrators pay lip service to free speech, but frequently they don't act on it. So let's look at Middlebury, the school that we began with. So to say that the students received a slap on the wrist would be too strong. It was more like a tap on the wrist. There were some students who received little notes in their permanent record, and there were others who were suspended, but it was probationary. No one was expelled. No one really suffered much at all. And the mood of smug intolerance on campuses shows no signs of abating. So what are we dealing with? Students have become confused about how to distinguish thoughts from feelings. The most activist students, and to this day they are still a minority, even at the most elite schools, but they seem to have been raised with the expectation that if something makes them uncomfortable, it must be suppressed. There was a Gallup poll that showed that 65% of undergraduates believed that if somebody used hate speech or ethnic slurs, that was not protected speech. Now, they may, no one has said to them that there's a difference between what's rude, what's impolite, what's bad taste, and what should be legally suppressed. So an insult has become a microaggression, and when students hear views that are uncongenial, they claim that they've experienced violence. If certain words are violence, then physical violence in response is merely self-defense. And sure enough, a number of Middlebury students excused the violent attacks on Charles Murray and Allison Stanger in just those terms. After the riot that greeted a proposed talk by the attention-seeking Milo Yiannopoulos, the Berkeley student newspaper ran 5 op-eds addressing the topic of violence as self-defense. So that's the sketch of the scale of the problem. I could go on and on, but let's not end on a sour note because there are reasons for hope. There's a backlash to all this. There are groups like the Foundation for the Individual Rights in Education, which is currently led by a liberal Democrat, and sues colleges that restrict free speech of students and professors. Liberal writers like the Atlantic's Peter Beinart have denounced the students at Middlebury, for example. Hundreds of professors have signed statements, such as the one circulated jointly by Princeton's Robert George and Cornell West, reaffirming their commitment to free expression. Even former President Barack Obama has rebuked college students for what he calls militant political correctness. Liberal colleges like Wesleyan have committed not just to inviting more conservative speakers and permitting them to be heard, but also to hiring more conservative faculty. These efforts deserve recognition and praise. The students who shouted down Murray and blocked Heather McDonald are not just rude, they were nearly delirious with self-righteousness. Of the hundreds of students who chanted and marched and carried signs, I would guess that none of them has probably read either of these scholars' work. So piercing that bubble of moral vanity is the first step toward wisdom. The young are often hotheads, full of indignation. That's not unusual, that's the natural course. But so often in academia, faculty fail to do their jobs due to their own immaturity and ideological rigidity. It must be the work of educators to guide students to modesty, prudence, and respect for others. Rather than be coddled and indulged, they should be challenged and reminded of how little they actually know. Only then can a true liberal education begin.
The problem of free speech and diversity on campus has specifically impacted the pro-Israel and Jewish community on campus, and Lauri Regan is going to talk to us about it.
Thanks, Shoshana, and thank you all for coming. Intifada, intifada, we support the intifada. Long live the intifada. Free, free Palestine. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Zionist criminals are not welcome here. Any support of Israel is hate speech. Hey, hey, ho, ho. The state of Israel's got to go. You are child murderers. Gas them, burn them. Humanity cannot progress with the parasitic Jews. Pro-Israel events are not welcome on our campus anymore. Leave school, you Jew. Go back to Israel, you effing Jew. Zionists should be sent to the gas chamber. Death to Zionists. With Jews, you lose. Kill the Jews, Hitler was right. Are these statements that college students hear, Jewish and non, across college campuses, that they see in posters, that they read on Twitter, are these considered anti-Semitism? My SPME colleague, Professor Richard Landis, wrote, and I quote, Jew hatred has taken many forms over the millennia-long history, constantly adapting to new conditions, mutating to best disseminate its means. under the conditions of modernity after the Holocaust UN Geneva Convention, where open hatred of all Jews is stifled by political correctness, anti-Zionism offers the most successful mutation. Anti-Zionist memes can fly where anti-Semitic ones are prohibited, and then bring them along. In 2004, former Soviet dissident Mona Charen recognized the difficulty in exposing this new anti-Semitism, since it was couched in what people like to say was legitimate criticism of Israel and as a social justice human rights movement. So he established what is now referred to as the 3D test to help distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. The first D is demonization. When Israel is demonized and Israel's actions are blown out of proportion, when Israelis are compared to Nazis and the West Bank is compared to Auschwitz, that's anti-Semitism. The second D is double standards. When Israel is singled out by the UN and other students on college campuses and real human rights abusers from Syria, Russia, China, Cuba are given a free pass, this is anti-Semitism. The last D is delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist, like no other peoples or country in the world, this is anti-Semitism. The State Department has also adopted the 3D test. And most recently, the new French President Emmanuel Macron has called anti-Zionism a reinvented form of anti-Semitism, something which Senator Chuck Schumer took to the Senate floor to herald. Martin Luther King Jr. stated the following in response to a question by a student that had attacked Zionism, quote, "When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism." To be clear, I'm not suggesting that all forms of criticism of Israel are anti-Semitic, but when Israel is demonized, its leaders compared to Nazis, when it is singled out and condemned using anti-Semitic images from Nazi Germany to attack Israel, when the attacks are factually inaccurate, it crosses a line. And at this point, I think it's fair to say that the comments that I read at the beginning of this remarks are clearly anti-Semitic. Before giving some examples, I want to share some statistics reflecting the increase in campus anti-Semitic incidents in recent years. Another SPME colleague, Leila Beckwith's group, it's called the AMCHA Initiative, that investigates anti-Semitism across college campuses, found that the number of anti-Semitic incidents has significantly increased over the past 3 years. In 2015, the number of incidents doubled more than the year before. There were 287 anti-Semitic incidents in the first half of 2016, which was a 45% increase from the prior year. And in the first half of 2017, there have been 380 incidents, which is another 32% increase. A Brandeis University report issued in July of 2015 found that more than 1/4 of undergrad students reported hostility towards Israel being a problem on their campus. Almost 1/4 reported being blamed for the actions of Israel simply because they were Jewish. 1/3 reported having been verbally harassed because they were Jewish. And 3/4 have been exposed to or overheard anti-Semitic comments on their campuses. The schools with the largest percentage of anti-Semitic sentiments and incidents are the Canadian universities and the University of California system, where 70% of Jewish students there reported that they had experienced some form of anti-Semitism, whether it be graffiti, name-calling, heckling, threats, or actual physical assaults. One more SPM colleague, Charles Jacob, has an organization called Americans for Peace and Tolerance that produced a film that's called Hate Spaces, The Politics of Political Intolerance on Campus. The premise for the film is that there's only one group in the country that is condemned and that is willfully attacked, and that's Jews. Jewish students face increased hostility and intimidation both inside and outside of the classroom. Universities have become the focal point for anti-Semitism in the U.S., and it combines with pro-Palestinian anti-Israel lobbies, faculty, and students, as well as threats and intimidation and lies and propaganda. This hate manifests itself in various forms, including Israel Apartheid Weeks that occur annually on our college campuses across the country. The environment of intimidation and harassment that results from all this is in complete contrast to the academic values that we expect from our universities. On campuses across the country, Jewish students have been harassed, intimidated, and physically assaulted, with their pro-Israel events being shut down and their free speech rights actually being infringed upon. At NYU, FAU, and Northeastern, for instance, mock eviction notices were taped to dorm room doors. At UC Irvine, as you pointed out, Mona, Israeli Ambassador Michael Oren's speech was disrupted, as well as an IDF speaker with Students for Justice and Palestine members literally barging in the door and campus police having to intervene. On the same campus, a Holocaust memorial was desecrated and destroyed, and swastikas were painted nearby. At Vassar, students and faculty simply planning an academic trip to Israel were harassed and traumatized. At the University of Chicago, Palestinian human rights activist and anti-BDS movement representative Bassam Ayyad had to be escorted out by campus police after SJP members shot him down and also threatened to kill him. At San Francisco State University, the administrators and campus police stood by and they watched the mayor of Jerusalem and a student group that invited him and all of the attendees be bullied and harassed off the stage. As one columnist wrote, freedom of speech was replaced with a policy of whoever shouts the loudest wins. Get the F off our campus was shouted through bullhorns, and over again, the inaction by the administrators proved that the columnist was in fact right. The president, one of the anti-Semitic professors, and the board of trustees are now facing a lawsuit for violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the First and 14th Amendments rights of Jewish students on their college campus, The suit alleges a long and extensive history of cultivating anti-Semitic and overt discrimination against Jewish students. The university is also facing a lawsuit seeking an end to a partnership they have established with a Palestinian university known for promoting terrorism and anti-Semitism, and which is described by Hamas as a greenhouse for martyrs, glorifying suicide bombers, and encouraging jihad against Israel. Students for Justice in Palestine is a spin-off of the Muslim Students Association, which is a front group for the Muslim Brotherhood. It has chapters at over 150 campuses in the country. They sponsor anti-Israel events and speakers and demonstrate and disrupt pro-Israel events and speakers. The AMCHA study found that campuses that have an active SJP chapter are 7 times more likely to have incidents targeting Jewish students. Universities would be justified in banning SJP from campus. They breach campus civil discourse codes, they do not respect the free speech of fellow students, and they encourage bullying and intimidation of pro-Israel students. Unfortunately, they continue to get away with this barely and rarely with a slap on the wrist. The university used to be the place where one could search for truth. Unfortunately today, campus anti-Semitism is on its way to becoming institutionalized with faculty who characterize Israel's self-defense as terror and Arab terrorism as a liberation movement, Israel's democracy as an apartheid state, and Arab totalitarianism as a successful governing system. Then they try and claim that their animus towards Israel is simply anti-Zionism, not anti-Semitism. They systematically deny Jewish history and the Jewish people's right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland and provide one-sided presentations and repression of legitimate debate. For example, a professor who teaches Mideast history at Stanford believes that suicide bombers are martyrs, endorses Holocaust denial, and compares Israeli leaders to Nazis. Another at Rutgers believes Jews deserve to die because they've exploited blacks. At DePaul, well-known anti-Semite Norman Finkelstein claims the Holocaust has been exaggerated and has expressed solidarity with the terrorist group Hezbollah. At the University of Wisconsin, an academic portrays Israelis as masters in the art of destruction using state-sponsored terror and including bloody and sadistic torture, and that Hamas suicide bombings are legitimate popular resistance. At Columbia, one professor continually calls Israel a racist state and believes that every racist state should be destroyed. At Kent State, a professor wrote a tribute to a Palestinian suicide bomber who murdered 2 Israelis in a Jerusalem supermarket, and an associate professor of history there, who was on the terrorist watch list, calls his students little jihadists and claims that Israel is a regime that is a spiritual heir to Nazism. Hatam Bazian, who is a professor at UC Berkeley, is also a co-sponsor of SJP. He calls for an intifada in the United States, claiming, quote, the only language the slave master understands is the language of violence. He has also stated that, quote, there were a large number of Zionists who were engaged with Nazi Germany, and, quote, our Congress is an Israeli-occupied territory, among other offensive and untrue accusations. Emmett is certainly not part of his we have representatives from the Endowment for Middle East Truth, which is EMID, which stands for Truth in Hebrew. We don't see too much of that on our college campuses these days. Ironically, the very place that is supposed to be a beacon for freedom of speech and where different ideas should be discussed and debated in a respectful manner is now one that calls for censorship, bans pro-Israel speech, and intimidates those with differing opinions. Combine this propaganda spewed in the classroom with the intimidation tactics used by groups from outside of the classroom, and we certainly have an uphill battle. At the core of the campus anti-Israel activities, and in particular at the efforts of SJP and the Muslim Students Association, is the anti-Semitic boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Boycotting Jewish products is nothing new and dates back to Nazi Germany, where the Holocaust actually started on college campuses. It's now an official tactic of political warfare today on our college campuses, and it's just one tactic that's used in the goal to delegitimize the homeland of the Jewish people. While BDS campaigns have little success in practice, their effectiveness, especially on college campuses, lies in their ability to alter the discourse and demonize Israel, delegitimize Israel, and hold Israel to a double standard, thus failing the 3D test. BDS activists aren't discouraged over failed resolutions because the attention and publicity that they receive about the poor Palestinians and the big bad Israelis just helps further their goal of indoctrinating and intimidating students. BDS goals are couched in claims of human rights and social justice, but in fact, they actually seek the end of the Jewish state and are the antithesis of university human rights values. BDS is sold to students as a peaceful movement designed to end the conflict, but its goal is miseducation and lies to achieve its objective to end the Jewish state. In fact, BDS founder Omar Barghouti has specifically stated that he is working for Israel's euthanasia. This faux human rights social justice movement also obscures the extremist, racist, terrorist, and radical individuals and motives behind it. And while I don't have time to get into it in detail, I can tell you that various BDS groups have direct connections to both Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a terrorist group designated as such by the State Department. The concept of intersectionality has also infected the anti-Israel animus. Pro-Palestinian groups are now forming alliances with other social justice warriors and indoctrinating those members with anti-Israel, anti-Semitic lies. For instance, Black Lives Matter activists carry signs reading "Justice from Ferguson to Palestine," seeking to link claims of American racism and police violence with claims of Israeli brutality against Palestinians. The Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy found that Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam is working directly with SJP to demonize Israel, including furthering the lie that the IDF is training U.S. police to kill black men. The National Women's Studies Association endorsed a boycott of Israel to condemn what they call sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by Israel against Palestinians, making a fictitious claim about the only Middle East country where full gender rights actually exist, and ignoring the repression of women's rights in Palestinian society. Jewish Voice for Peace, a rabidly anti-Israel organization that uses shaming, bullying, and dissemination of inflammatory propaganda to suppress pro-Israel voices, and which has expanded its presence on college campuses in recent years, links the Palestinian issue to, quote, the struggles of students of color, student survivors of sexual assault, and all others on college campuses fighting oppression. At Rutgers, a genderqueer studies professor delivered a diatribe accusing Israel of harvesting Palestinian organs for research, experimenting on Palestinian children, and targeting Palestinians for stunting and maiming. These professors clearly missed the lessons of history, which taught that what begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews. And the result is that anti-Israel hate, once on the margins, is now in the mainstream and considered acceptable and legitimate discourse. BDS doesn't just encourage anti-Semitism, it actually causes it. The strongest predictor of anti-Jewish hostility on campus is the presence of a BDS campaign against Israel. The greater the BDS activity, especially involving faculty members, the more likely anti-Semitic events take place. In 2015 and 16, we saw the largest increase in anti-Semitism at schools at which student governments took up anti-divestment resolutions. There was also a 33% increase in the number of pro-Israel events that were disrupted with staged walkouts, shouting at guest lecturers, and intervening with Israel-related educational activities. In one study, 60% of respondents said that, in their opinion, BDS activities promote hostile actions towards Jewish students. And as mentioned earlier, campuses that have an active SJP chapter are 7 times more likely to have incidents targeting Jewish students. I began my remarks with some quotes that Jewish students hear by the SJP and pro-Palestinian activists on campus. I'm going to end with some comments that there were 50 young men that all belonged to the AE fraternity on campuses across the country that were brought to a conference in 2014. These are some of the things that they shared. I fear wearing my Jewish star necklace to class. It's easier not to be identified as a Jew. Being against Israel has been the cool thing to do. Anti-Semitism has definitely affected my college career, whether it be the swastikas that were painted on my mailbox or the anti-Semite president of the student body. I'm afraid to walk around campus with my kippah. One of my best friends was walking to class and she was spit on by another student simply because he saw that she was wearing a Jewish star around her neck. I saw a Hitler salute. I was struck from behind and knocked unconscious. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, ICU for 10 days. I had a skull fracture, back fracture, bleeding of the brain, and a concussion. From another student, I had a concussion. My sister was punched in the face, grabbed by her hair, and pulled to the ground. My mom was punched in the stomach and pushed to the ground. Walking around campus now, I'm not going to lie, I do fear for my life. I'm constantly paranoid, like watching from behind. I'm actually afraid to walk by myself sometimes. This anti-Semitism is institutionalized. It's a tenet of what we deal with. It's every day. It's not a big deal. It doesn't show up in the newspapers because it's to be expected. And that's my point. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to go into some of the solutions that I think are possible to remedy some of this horrific, these occurrences on campuses. Perhaps we can touch on that during the Q&A. Thank you all.
Michael, I feel like we're sinking here. We've heard some horrible stories. We've heard a lot of bad news, and now it's your turn. And I hope you're going to talk to us about what college administrators and what campuses can do to help make it better.
Well, I'll do my best, Shoshana. It's a big task to cheer everybody up with this very real and very disquieting news. And I'm actually, full disclosure, going to share a little bit more bad news, but mostly some solutions. Let me first say thank you for the honor of being here with these distinguished colleagues. It really is just a delight to be part of this program. And although he's not here, I want to extend a real thank you to Congressman Lamborn, who's our host. And I want to say as a citizen how grateful I am to for what he's done to strengthen our defense, provide for our veterans, and show that stalwart commitment to America's allies, especially the state of Israel and its crucial but perilous position in the Middle East. Just a word about our organization and why we're particularly glad to be here. Since our founding in 1995, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, known for short as ACTA, has been vigorous in its defense of academic freedom and freedom of expression. As an organization that is devoted to ensuring that American higher education is the finest in the world, preserving such freedoms is simply a no-brainer. If education is the heartbeat of human progress, then surely the lifeblood of education is freedom of thought. Freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression. Uncompromising, indefatigable pursuit of truth is the hallmark that separates the scientist from the charlatan. That was what Nobel laureate Max Born once wrote. The choke points that delay human progress are the things that challenge the challenges that people put up to the freedom of expression, their efforts to silence such attempts to push the frontiers of knowledge and understanding. And when we look over the landscape of challenges to freedom of expression in American higher education, it really is very easy to get very, very depressed. In addition to what Mona Charen has pointed out, as she said, there's a long list of disinvitations. That's actually a new word. That's something we've had to coin in the last few years because it's become so common. And the irony is crushing. George Will disinvited from a special program to bring more conservative voices to Scripps College. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's labored under threat of her life, there is a fatwa against her for efforts to protect women all around the world from Islamic extremism. Ayaan Hirsi Ali disinvited from a school that bears the name of Louis Brandeis, arguably the greatest proponent of the First Amendment in this nation. Ben Shapiro, Orthodox Jew, pro-life, banned from DePaul University. This is all staggering. I do want to put in one little advertisement. We've invited Allison Stanger on October 20th to be with us at a panel in our annual conference on academic freedom. She'll be there with Columbia professor Philip Hamburger and the man who calls himself the hip-hop president of Dillard University, a president who had the courage to see through a candidates forum, including, to his own horror, David Duke, because he had earned the votes to the signatures to be on that panel. Somebody who values freedom of expression and the free exchange of ideas. And finally, my old classmate from Yale, Stephen Benner, who was one of the authors in the C. Van Woodward report on academic freedom. Come join us if you can. It'll be a lively discussion, and I think Alison Stanger has a lot to tell us now. And as Lauri pointed out so well, the BDS movement has been a particular and most dangerous threat to freedom of expression. Long list of eminent speakers who have been silenced by BDS. And it's for this reason that ACTA, as an organization committed to academic freedom and the freedom of ideas, published the essay that I've put on your seats, alternate seats, because this represents one of the most egregious threats to all the values that are at the core of the Academy. But I promised that I was going to try to lift everybody's spirits, and not in a fantasy way, but with some very real good news. Let me actually go back to something that some schools would need a trigger warning, the Bible. When Nehemiah was informed the remnant of them that are left are in great affliction and reproach, he wept, but then he acted. And his companions responded, "Let us rise up and we will build." That's what we all need to be doing. So let's share some good news. Building on a long history of academic freedom, in 2015, the University of Chicago adopted the findings of a committee on freedom of expression. Now known as the Chicago Principles, the university asserts, I'm quoting, "For members of the university community, as for the university itself, the proper response to ideas they find offensive, unwarranted, and dangerous is not interference, obstruction, or suppression. It is instead to engage in robust counter-speech that challenges the merits of those ideas and exposes them for what they are. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it." This was more than aspirational rhetoric. The following summer, the Dean of Students wrote to the incoming freshmen, "Our commitment to academic freedom means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial. And we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own." Other schools are now following Chicago's leadership. So far, 21 schools have done so. My organization, ACTA, has written to its network of 22,000 trustees around the country, urging them formally to adopt these principles. We've got a lot more work to do, but I don't think I'm being overly optimistic to say that the mood of the nation is slowly turning against this fecklessness that we see in so many places within higher education. To combat BDS and its threat to the core values of American higher education, we have the vibrant academic exchange network with well over 400 members on 170 campuses, committed to a better way than, I quote, "aggressive anti-democratic tactics galvanizing deep intergroup suspicions." In other words, the operating principles of the BDS movement. And some more good news. At Princeton, well, I'll start with the bad news. At Princeton, students invaded historic Nassau Hall overnight and occupied the president's office, demanding such things as mandatory cultural competency training, a new academic requirement in the study of non-Western and marginalized people, safe spaces, and more. 11 students, the power of 11, formed the Open Campus Coalition, politely wrote a letter to Princeton's president, outlining the ways in which these demands compromised academic freedom. The defense of academic freedom at Princeton was successful. No bizarre new academic requirements. Cultural competency training would not be mandatory. There would not be any new affinity housing. Princeton's president recently quoted Rick Santorum, who appeared on that campus, that vigorous, tough dialogue is what should happen on college campuses. Not just Rick Santorum, but the president of Princeton, reiterating those principles. That is to say, I sense a growing, albeit slowly, bipartisan recognition that intellectual diversity and freedom of expression must once again be the sacred operating principles of higher education. A bright rising star on the horizon is the Heterodox Academy, under the leadership of NYU Professor Jonathan Haidt, by the way, like the president of FIRE, not a conservative, not a Republican, but a person who understands what the academy is about. The Heterodox Academy assigns a numerical score to institutions according to the school's demonstrated commitment to fostering diversity of viewpoints. Hundreds of professors from around the political spectrum have pledged to support diversity of viewpoint on their campuses. New York Times, Frank Bruni, Washington Post, Catherine Rampal, to name two very prominent journalists, have been ferocious in their criticism of the failure of higher education to protect the core value of freedom of expression. And to finish that quote, President Obama himself had this to say: "Don't try to shut folks out. Don't try to shut them down, no matter how much you might disagree with them. There's been a trend around the country of trying to get colleges to disinvite speakers with a different point of view or disrupt a politician's rally. Don't do that, no matter how ridiculous or offensive you might find the things that come out of their mouths." These bright moments are no reason for complacency. As Mona Charen recounted, Yale University exploded over Halloween costumes, and the brave professor that tried to counteract the foolishness of telling adolescents what they could or could not wear is no longer there, nor is her distinguished husband. Within days of the demonstration, Yale's president found $50 million to, quote, enhance the excellence of its faculty by building diversity university-wide. And what happened? Student demands multiply all over the country. We cataloged about 47 in 2016. Oberlin, students wanted to get rid of any grade below C to give students more time for their activism. They also were very disturbed that the ethnic food that was being served to them was not authentic. We could go on, but let's get back to some, well, good news eventually. I have one more thing that we have to focus on, which is the etiology. One should not overlook the role that institutions have played themselves in fostering the student culture that gave rise to these behaviors. ACTA surveys large institutions periodically, and our surveys typically reveal that about half the students self-report that they feel that they have to agree with their professor to get a good grade. Now, maybe there's a bit of fetching there, but basically there is something wrong with the finding of that nature. So hence they receive a lesson in groupthink. Whereas in past eras, a professor who misused the classroom to indoctrinate would have been seen as a professional disgrace. Go back to the 1915 principles of the American Association of University Professors. Now such a charlatan is often praised as a, quote, activist professor. Even professional associations, as Lauri pointed out, American Studies Association, National Women's Studies Association, and the leadership of the American Anthropological Association have shown their willingness to compromise the professional mission in teaching and research to espouse the BDS movement. So we have some real threats that come from the breakdown of professional ethics. This disease is, of course, dangerous. A recent Gallup poll showed that 27% of college students believe it's right to censor political speech if it offends a group. Gallup touted the result as positive, that 73% of the students don't. I dissent. Over a quarter of our future leaders think that it's okay to censor political speech. Nearly half of college students surveyed think it's okay to prevent the press from covering one of their demonstrations if they are concerned that they won't get favorable coverage. Please. Anyone who's dealt with the press ought to know better than that. And what bothers me the most is that the price that was paid for freedom of speech, for freedom of the press, has been totally forgotten. So I want to conclude with a 7-point plan, a 7-step program for higher education. Every college needs to adopt the Chicago principles or something very much like them, and to make freedom of expression part of the mission statement reiterated in the college catalog and at major college events. Second, colleges must make intellectual diversity as important a goal as every other type of campus diversity and as much of a funding priority. Third, colleges must accept responsibility to educate for citizenship. Each year, ACTA does a survey of 1,100 colleges and universities to see how many of them require core subjects. Only 18% of colleges and universities, four-year colleges and universities, require even a single course on the history of our nation and our institutions of government. Civic ignorance is the cradle from which contempt for free institution will grow. Fourth, colleges must educate students to embrace intellectual diversity and debate, starting with a freshman orientation program. Purdue University, under the leadership of Mitch Daniels, does that now. Fifth, colleges must eliminate speech codes. They need to model respect for the First Amendment. Sixth, colleges must explicitly warn in student codes of conduct and in the faculty handbook that anyone who disrupts an officially scheduled event or silences a speaker will, in the case of students, be subject to long-term suspension or expulsion, and in the case of faculty, to termination, tenured or not. Seventh, colleges must take proactive steps to protect the right of controversial speakers to present their ideas. And if demonstrators violate policies against disruption, swiftly to enforce regulations and apply severe sanctions. While protecting the privacy of individuals, inform the campus community of the sanctions that were applied as a deterrent to future violations. That was 7. One more. Alumni and parents need to vote with their wallets. No freedom of expression, no money. Edward Burke observed, quote, "When bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall, one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle." We all have a lot of work to do. It's a fight that we can and we must win.
Thank you to our panel. I'm going to go to questions, but I'm also going to take the prerogative of chair to ask the first one. Mona, you said, and Michael, you reiterated as well, that it's the job of the universities to make clear what is and what is not acceptable. Mona, if they haven't learned the traits that you mentioned, modesty, politeness, acceptance, by the time they're 17 or 18 or 19 ago, is it a losing battle by the time they get to campus? And what do we do about the parents?
Well, I would say that that of course the parents bear a huge measure of responsibility for raising children who have such poor manners and such little respect for others. But an 18-year-old isn't finished developing, isn't finished learning. They arrive on campus pretty much clay to be molded. And if after the first episode of a mob attempting to shout down a speaker and not allowed to be heard, they were to see the object lesson that the university expelled several of the ringleaders, the message would get through right away.
Thank you. Now, would you introduce yourself, please, and then ask your question?
Alan Pizer, I work with investigating project. Following up on the money, that's where it all counts. Is a lot of money coming from the outside like it used to, like Saudi Arabia supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, and you discuss other organizations? Is it flowing into the colleges, for example, to accomplish BDS and everything like that?
Such things are happening, and ACTA has called upon boards of trustees to be very vigilant about what gifts they are accepting, under what conditions. Harvard had a serious brush with some very tainted money coming in. That was not unique. It is something that governing boards increasingly must be aware of. And obviously it's a daunting thing to tell somebody to take a bunch of money and to do whatever with it, but principles matter. And if a gift is being given with conditions that are going to allow indoctrination in violation of the principles of the institution, it has absolute compelling reason to reject it.
Can I just want to add one thing to that. Putting aside the terrorist money that supports the BDS movement, generally speaking, I recently learned that there are 100,000 Saudi students spread across the globe. 65,000 attend U.S. institutions. If you have 1,000 at UCLA, let's say, that's a lot of money. Those voices are going to be much more important to the president and the board of trustees than, you know, a handful of other students that are offended by anti-Semitic comments, for instance. So I think that you've got to keep in mind that particular number in the context of the question as well.
And I think keep in mind that those Saudis and other students pay full freight.
Yes.
They're not looking for scholarships, so every Saudi or Qatari or Abu Dhabi student is paying full freight, and so it makes it worse. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name's Joel Mandel, and I'm an attorney here in Washington. I used to be with the Justice Department. Why haven't your groups and Fire and everybody else loudly and excessively insisted that the Justice Department file criminal charges under Section 241 of the Criminal Code? It's a felony for two or more people to conspire to violate the constitutional or civil rights of anybody. You can get 10 years in prison for it. Now, why aren't you sitting there demanding that Sessions and every U.S. attorney start prosecuting these people? The Justice Department had an airtight case against Mike Nifong and probably professors in the administration at Duke University over the lacrosse case, and they lost their guts. They had a case and they wouldn't file it until groups like yours and others are incessantly demanding criminal prosecutions. Nothing is going to happen. And once some of these people start going to jail, all of this crap is going to stop.
Thank
So
you.
why isn't it happening?
Michael, do you want to take that one?
Thank you for the focus, the prod. We've certainly seen actions under Title VI, or I should say not actions but rumblings, but that's not nearly as effective as what you're describing. So thank you, and take that under consideration.
Yes. Hi, Jennifer Deco with the Endowment for Middle East Truth. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I have a question about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. I know Lauri brought it up. And I was wondering what everyone's thoughts might be as to why we're not seeing more action from the Department of Education or the administration to protect Jewish students on campuses under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And what do you think Congress or the administration should do about that?
Well, that would be one of the solutions that I would suggest that needs to be done. And I know that Sarah Emmett has been working from that perspective with Title VI on the Hill. And I think that that's a critically important step that needs to be taken. There's no reason why Jewish students should be an exception as any less protected class on college campuses than, let's say, Muslim students or black students or women and whatnot. And so I appreciate the work that Emmett's doing to pursue that, and I think other groups should as well.
If I may, I just want to add one caution that we always do need to be careful that we're targeting action that is pervasive, that is violation of Title VI, that is, and in no way do we cross that bright line of First Amendment. I very much hold with what Larry Summers said, that our obligation to protect students from discrimination is absolute. Our obligation to protect them from discomfort is non-existent. And it is often, of course, difficult in an emotional situation to remember those bright lines, but we have to keep them.
I'm Isaac Hibist, intern on the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and a Coastal student at Stanford. And I was wondering, how do you fight anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campus while also protecting the freedom of speech rights that groups that are supporting BDS have, even though we might, strongly disagree with the ideas that
Well, I think that, as I said, there's a difference between legitimate criticism of Israel. I mean, you can set up an apartheid wall, and you can lie all you want. There is no right, for instance, that no obligation, for instance, of school newspapers to publish those lies. So a student group can get a permit and set up a table, an anti-apartheid wall and whatnot, despite the fact that it's being funded by outside money. But there's no obligation that some of the hate speech, the anti-Semitic speech that we're seeing, should be permitted. It shouldn't be permitted necessarily in the classroom where teachers are spewing lies. I think there has to be a lot more focus on creating internal reviews, especially of Mideast studies departments. And we can focus on academic standards that should be met to ensure that truth is met. I mean, we need more balanced approaches. I don't think you can stop anti-Semitic speech on campus, but then you're crossing the line into calls for intifada. That's calls for violence. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's cause for the destruction of the Jewish state. So there's red lines that can be drawn. And I think that if a college were to adopt, for instance, the 3D test, we would have a clear understanding of what anti-Semitism is and when that line is crossed.
So you must have asked a very good question, because Mona and Michael both also wish to comment on it.
Just a brief response would be that often the best way to deal with those people is to expose them by asking them questions in a public forum. And just, when you have somebody from one of these groups and you say, what are the lines that Israel would be within that are acceptable to you? Would it be 1948? Would it be 1967? And what you find is that there, in many instances, they will openly say that none of those lines is legitimate. And then you've got them. I mean, they've acknowledged that it's not a matter of arguing over exchanges of territory. It's whether they believe Israel has a right to exist or not. So it's always best, the ideal thing is to expose them publicly and shame them.
I want to channel Mitch Daniels, the former governor of Indiana and the president of Purdue University. The best remedy for speech you don't like is more speech. Rather than trying to ban, to make sure that you have the right and the opportunity to respond. The example that I think should inspire all of us is what Lee Bollinger did when one of his deans invited Ahmadinejad to present at Columbia University, an awful, loathsome figure. What did Bollinger do? He took 10 minutes, he took his prerogative to use his own free speech and made an absolute fool out of him. Ahmadinejad was totally flat-footed. He couldn't respond to the questions that Bollinger threw at him. That was really effective, much more effective than making a martyr out of him by silencing him.
Sarah.
Right. I'm Sarah Sturm, the founder and president of the Endowment for Middle East Truth, and we've done a tremendous amount of work on this issue. One thing that I have to say is way back in 2005, I testified before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and there was, at that point, the discussion and the decision to make Jewish students a protected minority as a result of what not only I had said, but the other witnesses had said in their testimonies. However, it's been neglected and ignored. Now, free speech, which we all absolutely want to perpetuate on college campuses, does have limits for certain minorities. God forbid, anybody should use the N-word on college campuses. They are immediately expelled, mostly. But you are able to call a Jewish student an effing Zionist kid constantly, and that is considered free speech. And all that we would like is the same protections that other minorities have, so that students can have an educational experience that is unhindered by this sort of emotional or sometimes physical harassment.
Which I'm just going to say is was also part of the basis of the lawsuit against San Francisco State University, which goes to the 14th Amendment aspect of equal protection for the Jewish students as well.
I would draw a distinction between social mores and law. I would argue strenuously that the social mores that says it's wrong to use the N-word is a good one. And similarly, there ought to be just as strong a prohibition informally in our culture that you don't draw attention to people's ethnicity or, call names in the way that you describe. But I wouldn't want to see it enforced by the state.
You have a question in the back?
Yep, Jonathan Bruditsky.
Would you stand up, please?
Sure. I just want to ask about a philosophical conundrum between the relationship of free speech and viewpoint diversity. It seems to me the problem is if you have like a truly free market without regulation, it can allow for a monopoly to form. If you take like free speech on campus, it could allow for an ideological monopoly. So I'm wondering to what extent we actually need to ensure viewpoint diversity, play like an active role. Being a good conservative, I'm not sure I'm totally comfortable with quotas on the number of conservative or libertarian students or similarly with professors. So Michael, just maybe if you could go a little bit more into the kind of funded opportunities or engagements you were discussing, because I think it's a fine line.
You have indeed asked one of the most important and profound questions for academic procedures. Every hire needs to be made on the basis of merit. Every admission needs to be based on merit. That has to be the first and final criterion. Is diversity a good thing if it is genuine diversity? Yes, because it represents a range of opinions and experiences that enhances education. It keeps us from confirmation bias. That's to say, is that a familiar term? That our brains are so wired that we get a warm, tingly feeling when we see and embrace the familiar, whether it's right or wrong. And it takes very conscious effort to get beyond confirmation bias. This is why having a department of economics that's got free market economists as well as Keynesians is really important. Let that argument go on. And it is the business of administration when it finds that a department is slipping into an ideological monoculture to say, look, we'll put you in receivership if you can't do your academic business properly. If you cannot guarantee that the intellectual diversity that builds true education flourishes, then you need an intervention. So that's that careful balance. I don't like the idea of targeted hires because we have seen too often what that means. But somewhere in that balance between merit and range of opinion is going to be the most fruitful course.
Question
Yeah.
here.
Howard Marks, thank you for the panel. I know a little bit about higher education. I taught very briefly at one of the schools that was mentioned, and also I'm very active in 3 alumni associations. So my question is about getting the information out to the consumers. I mean, I'm talking about to the parents. People come to me and say, well, I'm Jewish parents, where should I send my son and daughter? Where is it safe? Well, I say, don't send them to Evergreen. Whatever you do, don't send them to Evergreen. All right, don't send them to UC Irvine. That's a no-brainer. It's in the newspaper all the time. Then I just heard the other day, I talked to someone that's going to UCLA. My God. Los Angeles, second largest Jewish population in the United States. They're having problems at UCLA. So what about rating and ranking colleges? Excuse me, let me just finish the question, and I'll sit down. And then getting that word out, whether it's online, a source well-documented, researched, not subject to being sued, whatever. So when if I'm one of my relatives or friends comes to me, I could say, you know, you should try this school because your son or daughter is going to be safe there, and they're going to learn, etc. Please.
This exactly has been done, and most recently the Algemeiner, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, I can write down their website for you afterwards. They just issued the 40 worst schools in the country for Jewish students to attend, and I think it was the 15 best schools for Jewish students to attend. I have an older son at NYU, he's sadly in the worst, and there is a very high Jewish population there. I have twins at Tulane, and they are one of the best. So I don't necessarily think that the number of Jewish students is a prediction. Cornell's has been ranked pretty poorly. The Freedom Center also puts out an annual report of the worst campuses for Jewish students to attend. So those are two resources for you.
And if you need another resource, stand with us. If you have a specific school that doesn't appear on the list, they're very good at figuring out what is good and what is not good for Jewish students. Stand with us, call them up and say, I'm interested in X college, and they will come back to you with a report. My son was, as a professor, was offered a job at Berkeley, which he turned down, for Vanderbilt, where he's extremely happy. So you weigh all of these things in the
I would just add one thing, which is it's not specifically about Jewish students, but just about their respect for free speech rights. FIRE does an evaluation of about several hundred colleges and universities around the country, giving them either a red light, a green light, or a yellow light based on their respect for free speech, whether they have speech codes and so forth. So that's helpful.
If I just follow up, these are all great ideas. And it takes a lot of being informed, different websites and so on. A consolidated list that maybe comes from the top of the Jewish organization, whether it's B'nai Brik or whether it's through Hillel or whatever, one-stop shopping. Because one thing I know about the universities is that they're fearful of losing those alumni contributions. Those are huge in terms of financing, especially with state cutbacks going on all over the country. And losing those Jewish students would certainly get their attention.
I would add just one thing which is coming from a totally different direction. We channel Churchill here. Never give up. We cannot turn our great campuses over to the disruptors, to the forces of darkness. I am the parent of several children, and one does not want to see one's child in the line of fire. But we've all got to keep up the fight, and whether that's top-down or encouraging and supporting our young people to be there and to take leadership positions, this is crucial. We can't turn over UCLA to the mob. We've got to save UCLA.
Marvin.
I'm Marvin Cleanoff. About 5, 6, 7 years ago, and I have a witness, I wrote a letter to his organization, to AIPAC, to CHINSA, saying, what are we going to do about this problem? No response. No answer. It's major Jewish organizations may talk about it, words, but no one is really doing anything. I offered using my own money to go out to the Hillels and educate people how they could counter this, what they should be doing, and I won't go into the speech I would give to Hillel. Why aren't we more organized to counter this? I appreciate all your comments. You've added meat to the bones that we all know. We all know this problem exists, but no one's really doing anything about it. Concrete, let me finish, to allow an individual who can afford to go out and do something about it to do it. Where is the organization to counter this problem?
I would argue that the Jewish community was late to wake up to the problem, but it has woken up. There was a recent conference in Israel, the Herzliya conference, that specifically addressed anti-Semitism on college campuses, which a number
Was it against the Sephardics or the Ashkenazis?
Thank you, Marvin.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Israeli government has set up a war room, basically, to deal with this, that 24/7, they have 15 people working round the clock that are addressing the BDS movement and anti-Semitism on college campuses, and the BDS movement more expansively. And I think that the reason why we're seeing wins and that a lot of these divestment resolutions are not passing is because of this. We've finally woken up and they're successfully being fought. The issue with Hillels is a completely different issue, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. But Hillel there's open Hillels, there's Hillels, they're Hillel's figuring out the politically correct way of dealing with these issues as well. But generally speaking, I think that our community has woken up and is starting the fight.
Thank you. Okay, one thing I do like to do is promise people that they will be out when we said they would be out. So I'm going to take 2 last questions in a row and then let the panel go to. I'm going to take your question and one over there. So ask your question, then you'll ask your question, and we'll wrap.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. My name is Mark King, a retired U.S. Army officer and now retired corporate executive. My concern is that perhaps we're sending our young people to the universities a little too soon.
in that I like to think that the Israeli way of doing this is a far better system than what we do here in the United States. 2 years mandatory military service, followed by a year of get the travel bug out of your system, followed by attendance at universities, which produces a much higher finishing rate than we produce here in the United States. We live in a country that's loath to have a military conscription system. However, as one that entered the United States Army in 1966 when the draft was going on hot and heavy, I can tell you that it provides a much broader perspective to our young people. I met a young man from Yazoo, Mississippi, who thought Jews had horns, literally, in 1966. I met surfers from California and cowboys from Montana, and it was an experience that I think broadens young people's minds, puts them in an institution that provides them some discipline. You don't have to like it, but it's something that ultimately produces a better system. I'd be interested to hear your views.
Thank you. Then we'll get, where did my last, here it is.
Yeah.
Last
Hi, Evan Plaskowski from Congressman Joe Polis's office. I agree the rise of anti-Semitism is definitely very, I'm a college student, I see it, especially on social media. It's definitely very concerning. But to what extent is someone allowed to criticize, I mean, Israel is not a perfect state. To what extent is someone allowed to criticize certain aspects without being called anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and suppressed in the same way that these social justice warriors are suppressing people? For example, the UN published in 2014 that 1,400 Palestinian civilians were killed at the hands of the Israeli forces.
Question, please.
Yeah. Well, I asked my question. Is that considered anti-Semitic just to state that fact and say that, yes, Israel has a right to a state, but there are some problems that need to be addressed? Is that anti-Semitic, just to mention that?
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the panelists to take both questions, or either question.
Let me start with last question, and a totally fair one. The simple answer is everything is up for discussion in a healthy campus. And what I would encourage you to do is to just change the group identity and ask yourself if that were applied to X, Y, Z, would you consider it to be racist, homophobic, discriminatory? And whether, as Mona Charen said, whether it's something that really needs to be dealt with in terms of a social norm, or whether it's something that's pushing against the boundaries of Title VI, because there's a real distinction there. And I would counsel you to take a very careful read of the C. Van Woodward report of 1975. The committee at Yale concluded that shock, outrage, and hurt are surely things that we need to be serious about, but that the final value of the academy is to be able to think about the unthinkable and to express the unspeakable and to be able to argue these things out. So a quick answer to your question, everything should be fair game for free and honest discussion. And if it's crossing the line into creating a climate in which people cannot pursue their educations, which is a violation of Title VI, then deal with it under those grounds. But be fair about the way you're applying those categories. When you're looking at discrimination, think about how you would apply those same principles to every group.
And I'll just add on that point that a couple things. The one of the 3 Ds was double standard, and so there's an obsession with Israel on college campuses. You don't see criticism of the way the Palestinians are being treated in Jordan or the way they're being treated in Syria. You see criticism of the way they're being treated simply in Israel. You don't see criticism of human rights abuses, of gay Muslims being thrown off rooftops in Iran. But all you're hearing is that when gays can march in Tel Aviv for a gay march parade, that's just pinkwashing. Really, Israel's just trying to make themselves look good. So there's this obsession, and it's the double standard, and it's that's what makes it wrong. I'm not saying it's not allowed to be spoken. It certainly is. But there's this misinformation that's being produced. And when you talk about a UN study, let's talk about the UNESCO decision that basically says that Jews have no historic connection to the lands in Jerusalem. You know, the things that come out of the UN, the Goldstone report, for instance, this is not an organization that can be trusted with its facts and figures. They can be tweeted out over and over again. That doesn't make them any more true. It's that Mark Twain saying about, the lie. What's the lie?
Travels all the way around the world by the time the truth gets
His
boots
pants on, right. And then the only other thing that I want to say about what you said, sir, and thank you for your service, is that I have been saying this for at least a decade, that if these students were forced to go into military service, even if it was 6 months of boot camp and come out with some discipline, we would see grown-ups finally on our college campuses.
Well, let me second everything that Lauri just said. Very, very well said. Thank you. And also, Mike. I agree about the lack of maturity of our college students. I think it would be a heavy lift to get this country to demand universal military service. By the way, one of the benefits that we might see is that, as it is now with the all-volunteer military, some huge percentage of American 18-year-olds, I think I read that it was 60%, you check that, are too overweight to even qualify for military service. Just really, anyway, and J.D. Vance in his book Hillbillyology was quite eloquent about the fact when he joined the Marine Corps that there were basic things about how to organize your life, how to balance your checkbook, how to rent a car, how to do basic things in life that he didn't know how to do, and that the Marine Corps taught him, and it helped him to be. Then he went on to college, and it helped him to be a much more successful adult. So I support what you say. I just don't think it's a realistic possibility in this country. I wish it were.
As the mother of a 20-year Army veteran daughter, I agree with you. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, thank you very much for enlightening us